We usually meet the Philistines as the villains. They stride into biblical stories like a ready-made shadow. Loud, armed, unwanted. In many modern languages, their very name even became an insult. A Philistine is supposed to be crude, uncultured, a person who cannot see beauty even when it stands right in front of them. But that old stereotype is the final layer of a much older story. A story that begins long before David ever lifted a sling. A story buried under centuries of propaganda, fear, and forgetting. Because the truth is simple, and it is stranger than the myth. Philistine cities were once among the largest of their age. Their culture was not primitive. It was vivid. Their society could be disciplined and coordinated. In technology and social organization, they surpassed many of their neighbors. And for a time, they stood at the center of a region where power was measured in grain, bronze, sea lanes, and the ability to hold a line when everything else was collapsing. So let's peel the myth away. Let's dig beneath 27 centuries of forgetting. During the late Bronze Age, Egypt dominated Canaan. Not with a gentle hand, but with the logic of empire. Control the coast, control the roads, control the ports where ships pause and caravans rest. Cities like Ashdod, Ashkelon, and especially Gaza served as key fortresses that helped the Egyptians hold the region and the major trade routes running through it. And those routes mattered. This strip of land was essentially the only land corridor linking Mesopotamia and Egypt. It was the narrow passage between worlds. Caravans moving west made their last stop here before reaching the Nile Delta. Ships sailing down the coast from the north paused in these harbors as well, taking on water, swapping cargo, trading news, spreading ideas. All of this poured wealth into Egyptian hands. Not just gold, but stability, taxes, tribute, the quiet confidence of a power that believes the world will keep turning the same way it always has. Then it didn't. Around the turn of the 13th and 12th centuries BC, disaster swept across the eastern Mediterranean. The old order cracked like dry clay. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for centuries, vanished without a trace. Macedonian palaces in Greece burnt. In Syria, dozens of fortified cities were destroyed or abandoned within a single generation. The ground itself seemed to change its mind about the future. Pollen analysis from the Bronze Age layers shows that around 1250 BC, the region was struck by a severe drought, a climate crisis. Not a single bad season, but a grinding pressure that starved fields and emptied storehouses. It did not destroy civilizations by itself. It didn't need to. It simply pushed already stressed systems over the edge. When harvests fail, politics turns violent. When trade breaks, armies go hungry. When borders weaken, everyone starts moving. And out of that chaos emerged a name that still feels like a threat. The so-called Sea Peoples. They were not one nation marching under one banner. They were a loose coalition of displaced groups, people fleeing famine, destruction, and the collapse of their homelands. Some were raiders, some were refugees, some were both, depending on the day and the shoreline. Egypt's first recorded encounter with them came in 1208 BC, when a Libyan chieftain named Murier allied himself with groups such as the Akaiwasha Luka and Shalesh Tersia and Sharan, and launched an invasion of Egyptian territory. It was not a random attack. It was desperation with weapons. Mepa mustered an army, defeated the invaders, and took many of them captive. But the shockwaves kept spreading. The inhabitants of southern Canaan tried to take advantage of Egypt's instability. They rebelled and expelled the Egyptian garrisons. For a moment, it probably felt like freedom. The kind that arrives when a giant stumbles and you believe it will never rise again. MPA responded immediately. He marched into Canaan and devastated the region. The RPA steely describes the campaign in stark, triumphant lines, not with sorrow, not with doubt. With the cold rhythm of imperial certainty, Canaan is plundered, carried off with every evil. Ashkelon is conquered. Gezer is captured. Yanoam is as though it never existed. Israel is laid waste. Its seed is no more. Those words are meant to sound eternal, like a verdict carved into stone. But empires can carve anything into stone. That doesn't make it permanent. The main wave of the Sea Peoples reached Egypt later under Ramesses III. Among them was a group that Egyptian sources called Peliset. They appear in several inscriptions, but the most important are the reliefs and texts from the Temple of Medinet Habu, dated to around 1175 BC, and the Great Horus Papyrus, written around 1152 BC. On the reliefs, the images hit you like a drumbeat. Warriors with feathered headdresses, ships with bird-shaped prows, segmented armor, kilt-like skirts, a look that is not Egyptian, not Canaanite, not the familiar uniform of the old powers. They look like they came from somewhere else. Ramesses III boasts that he crushed these invaders, that he stopped their assaults on both land and sea, that he captured many of them alive. And then comes the detail that changes the entire story. After his victory, he resettled part of the captives in southern Canaan, the Peliset in Gaza, Ashdod, and Ashkelon, and its Jer in the port city of Dor further north. Most likely, Ramesses, like rulers before him, settled these groups along Egypt's borders so they could serve as a living buffer against future incursions. A human shield made into policy. A frontier strengthened not by walls, but by people who knew what it meant to fight for a landing place. And the resettlement took place peacefully because it happened with the pharaoh's approval. In the archaeological layers from this period, we see no traces of destruction, fire, or battle. Nothing that would suggest a military invasion. That matters. It changes the tone. The Philistines do not begin here as conquerors storming the gates. They begin as the relocated survivors of a collapsing world, placed on a border that was still bleeding, told to build lives on land that had already been burned once by Egyptian punishment. Even so, the Peliset who were moved into Canaan remained a minority compared to the local Semitic population. Despite MPA's devastation, the people of the land continued to live there. They rebuilt, they married, they traded, they argued, they adapted, because that is what humans do when the world refuses to stay still. Over time, the Peliset blended with the Semitic inhabitants, and from this mixture emerged a new people, those whom Hebrew sources called Pelishim, known today as the Philistines. That transformation is the hinge of everything, because once you see it, you can no longer treat them as a simple other. They were newcomers, yes, but they were also becoming local. They were a moving frontier that turned into a permanent shoreline. They were a people forged from collision, between empires, between drought and hunger, between sea and land, between memory and survival. And in the next chapter, that new people doesn't just settle. They organize, they build a system of power along the southern coast that will terrify their neighbors, challenge emerging kingdoms, and shape the battlefield politics of the region for centuries, through a confederation of 5 city-states and a title found nowhere else in the ancient Near East. The Sarans are coming. The moment the Peliset stopped being captives on a border and became a political machine, the map of southern Canaan began to change. At the beginning of the 11th century BC, the people now known as the Philistines did something that looks almost modern in its logic. They did not scatter into villages. They did not dissolve into the countryside. Instead, they anchored themselves to the coast and built power where power had always lived in this region. In cities, along the southern shoreline, they established a confederation of 5 city-states: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath. Together, these cities formed what later writers call the Philistine Pentapolis. Each city had its own ruler, but what mattered was how those rulers behaved when outsiders came near. Each city was ruled by a Sarin, a political title found nowhere else in the ancient Near East. It is a small detail, easy to miss, but it carries weight. Titles reveal identity. They show what a society thinks leadership should look like. And the Sarin was not a copy of Egyptian bureaucracy or Canaanite kingship. It sounds like something that grew from a different tradition, then adapted fast to a new land. Each Sarin governed his own city. But in foreign affairs, the 5 city-states acted together. They presented a unified front. They made collective decisions for the entire confederation. When it was time to bargain, threaten, trade, or fight, Philistia moved like a clenched fist rather than 5 open hands. That unity would become one of their greatest weapons, but a weapon needs a story behind it. And for the Philistines, the oldest question still hangs in the air like smoke after a fire. Where did the Peliset come from? The exact homeland of the Peliset remains uncertain. According to biblical tradition, the Philistines came from a place called Caphtor. The Bible does not specify where Caphtor was, but it has long been associated with Cree, because in many ancient languages the island's name sounds similar. The Egyptians called it Keftu. The Assyrians and Babylonians kept related forms as well. The echoes are close enough to make the theory feel almost obvious. Yet history rarely stays inside neat boxes. What we can say with growing confidence is that the Philistines carried a deep connection to the wider Aegean world. Not because later writers wanted it, but because the soil keeps giving up clues that point in the same direction. Their material culture is filled with Aegean elements. Philistine pottery, both in shape and decoration, closely resembles Macedonian and Cypriot ceramics. At first glance, you might think these vessels were imported, carried across the sea like luxury goods. But mineral analysis of the clay tells a different story. These were not shipped in from overseas. They were made locally in Canaan, which means something more interesting happened. A style crossed the water, and then hands on this coast reproduced it, again and again, until it became normal. You can see it in small objects too. Consider figurines that resemble a Cryate warrior. The silhouette lines up with Egyptian depictions of Peliset fighters. Or look at that famous figurine of a Philistine goddess, the one archaeologists call Ashdoda after the city where she was found. Her features and posture feel strangely at home beside similar goddess figures from Cyprus. These are not perfect copies. They are cousins. Family resemblance, not cloning. Even daily life tells on them. Traditional Canaanite households used clay ovens for cooking. But in Philistine towns, archaeologists suddenly find hearths built from sea pebbles, a form typical of the Aegean islands. It is a quiet clue, the kind you could step over without noticing. Yet it matters. You do not change the way you cook unless you bring habits from somewhere else, and those habits survive the journey. Architectural details, burial customs, and other patterns point in the same direction. The Philistines did not appear out of nowhere. Their roots lie across the sea. Still, not everyone agrees on the exact starting point. Some scholars have suggested a different origin, tying the Philistines to what is now Syria. This idea leans on Luwian inscriptions mentioning a Syrian state called Wallist or Palestine. In Luwian, the sounds W, P, H, and P can alternate, so the names look tempting. But the theory rests mostly on similarity of names, and names can mislead. The capital of Palestine has been excavated, and what emerges there points to a Neo-Hittite population, not a clearly Philistine one. Even the timing is awkward. The state appears not before the Philistines arrived in Canaan, but at the same time. Another hypothesis suggests that a small offshoot of Philistines may have settled in Syria and then been absorbed quickly by the local Neo-Hittite world. So the Syrian option remains possible at the edges, but it does not replace the larger picture. Then, in 2019, a different kind of evidence entered the conversation. Not pottery, not architecture, not inscriptions, but DNA. DNA analysis from Philistine-era burials showed that early Iron Age Philistines carried a strong Southern European ancestry component, closely related to ancient populations of the Aegean, Sardinia, and the Iberian Peninsula. In plain terms, the bodies themselves carried a memory of the sea. This does not mean every Philistine was born across the water. It does not turn history into a simple migration arrow. But it does support what the artifacts had been whispering for decades. Overall, we can confidently say the Philistines came from the wider Aegean world, even if pinpointing their exact homeland remains impossible for now. Some evidence points toward Crete and Macedonian Greece. Other clues point toward Cyprus or the Aegean Islands. It may well be that the Peliset were not a single people at all, but a coalition of tribes from different parts of the Aegean, pushed into motion by the same collapsing storm. Their language could have answered more, but the evidence is thin. We have only a few Philistine words preserved in biblical texts, a handful of personal names, and some toponyms. Enough to suggest an Indo-European flavor in the earliest layer, but not enough to rebuild the whole tongue. A few Philistine tablets have been found with symbols resembling Cryate linear script, and the idea is thrilling at first. But scholars disagree on whether this Philistine linear writing is actually related to the Cryatite system. The shapes and the combinations differ in ways that are hard to ignore. It might be imitation. It might be a cousin system. It might be something else entirely. Later, the Philistines adopted the Phoenician alphabet. But by that time, something even more dramatic had already happened. They had shifted to a Semitic language, and they did it fast. The Philistines became Semitized with remarkable speed. Within roughly the span of a few generations becoming grandparents, the European genetic signature visible in the earliest Philistine burials fades from view. Intermarriage with the local population diluted the newcomers' genes so thoroughly that over time, the difference blurred into the background. Genetically, they became hard to separate from surrounding Semitic peoples. Yet names can outlive blood. For centuries after that, everyone, including the Philistines themselves, continued to call them Philistines. Identity is not only DNA. It is memory, city walls, shared enemies, shared festivals, shared stories about where you came from and why you belong. Their culture assimilated just as quickly, and the shift shows most clearly in religion. In the Aegean world they had left behind, female deities often stood at the center of religious life. That tradition is reflected in the early figurines found at Philistine sites. But by the 11th century BC, that female-centered pantheon had largely disappeared, replaced by the gods of Canaan. Their chief deity became Dion, an ancient grain god worshipped by the Amorites in Syria since at least the 23rd century BC. Great temples of Dion stood in Gaza and Ashtod. In Ekron, the people venerated Baal-Zeab. The Philistines also worshipped Astarte, Anat, and other West Semitic deities. Step by step, they were weaving themselves into the spiritual fabric of the land, even while keeping a political identity that remained distinct. At first, the Philistine city-states recognized Egypt's authority and paid tribute. That was the price of survival on an imperial frontier. But in the middle of the 11th century BC, Egypt entered a period of turmoil. Fragmentation, civil conflicts, internal wars. The old hand on Canaan loosened. With Egypt distracted, the Philistines threw off Egyptian rule. And once that leash snapped, the confederation did what confederations do when they taste freedom. They looked outward. Their borders touched rivals on every side. But one rival, in particular, would become the defining opponent in the stories that survived. The Israelites to the north and east, a loose coalition in the hills, watching the coastal cities grow rich and strong, and slowly realizing that the next age would not be decided by bronze or by prayers, but by unity, iron, and the will to dominate the frontier. To understand why the Philistines would soon become the most feared name in the highlands, you have to watch what happens when a coastal confederation meets a land of tribes. By the middle of the 11th century BC, Egypt's grip on Canaan loosened. The old imperial hand that once controlled ports and roads now trembled with internal turmoil. Fragmentation, civil conflict, rival power centers pulling in opposite directions. The world that had forced the Peliset into a border role suddenly looked away, and the Philistine city-states seized the moment. They had already learned the most important lesson of the late Bronze Age collapse. When the big powers fall, survival belongs to those who can organize fast. Philistia's strength was not only in walls and harbors, it was in its system. 5 cities, 5 Sarons, one shared foreign policy, one collective instinct to act together when danger rose on the horizon. At first, their position was cautious. They had lived under Egypt's shadow. They had paid tribute. They understood the price of provoking a giant. But when the giant stopped watching, the confederation did not stay still. It expanded its influence like water spreading across flat land. Their rivals were everywhere. To the south and the desert edge were groups whose names survive only as faint silhouettes in later traditions. To the north and east were the Israelites, not a single kingdom yet, not a centralized state, more like a patchwork of communities in the hills and valleys, a loose coalition of sub-ethnic groups, what biblical tradition calls the 12 tribes of Israel. In those early centuries, the Philistines held advantages that felt unfair. The first was unity. The 5 city-states of the Pentapolis could argue among themselves, but when an outsider threatened the coast, they moved together. Their Sarons made collective decisions. They presented a unified front. They acted like a machine with one purpose. The Israelite tribes, in contrast, acted independently. Different leaders, different priorities, different rivalries. The old line from the Book of Judges captures the mood with brutal clarity. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In stories preserved by later writers, there were even moments when one Israelite group sided with the Philistines against another. That is what fragmentation looks like under pressure. Not cowardice, just a system that has not yet learned how to become a single fist. The second advantage was technological. The Philistines were among the first people in Canaan to adopt iron weaponry on a large scale. They almost certainly brought key knowledge with them, then refined it on the coast, where trade and skilled labor were easier to gather. Archaeologists have uncovered plenty of Philistine iron weapons, swords, spearheads, axes, as well as iron tools. It is not just the metal, it is what the metal represents. A society that can standardize production. A society that can equip fighters reliably. A society that can turn workshops into muscle. For a time, tradition even suggests the Philistines tried to control access to iron, limiting its spread to nearby groups. Whether or not that policy existed exactly as later texts describe, the core idea fits the landscape. If one side holds better blades, it holds the future. The Bible later mentions that David and Solomon owned iron swords viewed as symbols of high status. That detail is revealing. When a weapon becomes a status symbol, it means it is still rare enough to be admired. Like a bright new technology that has not yet become normal. But no advantage lasts forever. Iron spreads, skills travel, smiths learn. The highlands begin to catch up. And when the Israelites transitioned to wider iron use, the battlefield changed. Still, in the early phase, the Philistines dominated. The tribes of Israel fell under Philistine control. Philistia's borders expanded eastward. In several Israelite towns, Philistine governors appear in tradition like heavy footsteps. This was not just war. It was administration, influence. A coastal confederation reaching into the hills and saying, quietly but firmly, "This belongs to us now." In one famous episode preserved in biblical tradition, the Philistines even captured Israel's most sacred object, the Ark of the Covenant. The story says they later returned it, shaken by disasters they interpreted as divine warning. Whether you read that as theology, propaganda, or memory filtered through fear, it still tells you something real. These were not minor border skirmishes. This was a struggle over identity, over whose God protected whom, over which way history would lean. Then comes the shift. Around 1000 BC, the Philistine advantage began to fade, not because their cities suddenly became weak, but because their pressure forced a transformation among their enemies. Burdened by Philistine domination, the Israelite tribes started to unify under a single authority. And that unity had a face. Israel gained its first king, Saul. Saul fought the Philistines with mixed success, according to tradition. That phrase matters. Mixed success means the Philistines were still powerful. It also means they were no longer unbeatable. The hills were learning how to fight as one. This period also includes the most famous duel in the entire Philistine story, David and Goliath. Goliath is described as an unusually tall and powerful warrior from the Philistine city of Gath. Before battle, he steps forward and challenges Israel's best fighter to single combat. When no one accepts, he taunts the Israelites as cowards. It is classic psychological warfare. Humiliation before bloodshed. Then the young David approaches, not armored like a champion, not trained like a court warrior. He kills Goliath with a single well-aimed stone from his sling. It is a story that has become myth-sized, but archaeology adds a strange, intriguing echo. At Tel Es-Safi, identified with ancient Gath, excavators found an inscribed potsherd, an ostracon, dated to the early Iron Age. On it appear letter sequences that many scholars have connected to the name Goliath, not as proof of the biblical warrior himself, but as evidence that a similar name was used in that Philistine world. It is like hearing a familiar word in a crowd and realizing the crowd is real. Wikipedia +1. After Saul's death, David became king of Israel. And here the story turns sharper, more complicated, and more human. While Saul was still alive, David fell out of favor and had to take refuge among the Philistines. He even entered their service. Later, once he became king, Philistine mercenaries formed his personal bodyguard. That is not a simple us versus them. That is politics, survival, the blurred lines of frontier life where today's enemy may be tomorrow's shield. As king, David dealt heavy defeats to the Philistines. The confederation system, the old unity of the Sarons acting as one, could not endure repeated shocks forever. Some major Philistine centers suffered severe destruction in the centuries that followed. The old balance cracked, and when the old unity cracked, something changed inside Philistia. Instead of being ruled collectively by saurians working in concert, each city increasingly behaved like a separate kingdom. Coordination weakened, collective strategy frayed. In warfare, that kind of fracture can be fatal because it invites outsiders to pick off one city at a time. A confederation only works when trust holds. When trust fails, every wall becomes lonely. Even so, the Philistine cities retained their importance. They were too well placed to vanish quickly. Ports draw merchants, roads draw armies, soil draws farmers. Philistia remained a prize. After David, and later Solomon, the Philistine cities continued to maneuver for survival. When the united monarchies split into Israel and Judah around 930 BC, the Philistine cities regained independence and soon found themselves in frequent border conflicts with both kingdoms. The frontier became restless again. In 843 BC, the Philistines, together with allied Arab tribes, even captured and plundered Jerusalem. It is a striking reminder that Philistia, though pressured, was still capable of projecting force deep inland when the moment was right. But the same century also signaled a new danger. Trade began to shift. Phoenicia entered its golden age and tightened its grip over Mediterranean maritime routes. As Phoenician influence grew, the relative importance of Philistine ports declined. Coastal power was no longer a simple game of harbors and ships. It was becoming a contest of networks. Who could connect the sea lanes better? Who could dominate the markets? Who could make their cities indispensable? And then, from the far northeast, a different kind of empire began to move. An empire that did not bargain like a trader and did not raid like a refugee fleet. It marched like a machine, and in 735 BC, the Assyrians arrived. The arrival of the Assyrians did not feel like another border war. It felt like the ground itself had decided to move. By 735 BC, the Neo-Assyrian war machine had already torn through Anatolia, humbled Urartu, and imposed its will on Media. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria was no longer a kingdom testing its strength. It was an empire that knew exactly how strong it was, and it was turning its gaze toward the wealth of the Canaanite coast. The Philistine cities understood the danger immediately. Alone, none of them could stand. Even together, their chances were thin. So when Assyria advanced, Philistia did what frontier states have always done when a giant approaches. They looked for allies. A broad anti-Assyrian coalition formed. At its center stood Rezin, king of Damascus. Alongside him were the Phoenician cities under Hiram of Tyre. Several Arab tribes joined as well. The northern kingdom of Israel committed its forces, and among them stood the Philistine cities of Gaza and Ashkelon, ports that knew what Assyrian control would mean for their independence. One ruler chose differently. The king of Judah, Ahaz, sided with Assyria. The fighting dragged on for years. Not as a single decisive clash, but as a grinding demonstration of Assyrian patience. City by city, ally by ally. Resistance collapsed. Damascus fell. Rezin was defeated. The Aramaean kingdom was erased. The message was clear. Tiglath-Pileser's victory was so complete that the remaining members of the coalition, including the Philistine city-states, laid down their arms and submitted. They became vassals. They kept their walls. They kept their rulers. But their freedom was now measured in tribute schedules and obedience. Assyria had arrived to stay. Egypt was the only power that could have challenged Assyria directly. By this time, it had recovered from its internal chaos. But Egypt chose caution. It preferred a buffer zone of smaller states, Israel, Judah, the Philistine cities, between itself and a powerful expansionist empire. Egypt encouraged rebellion with words and promises, but rarely with soldiers, and so the region fell into a grim rhythm. Whenever trouble erupted somewhere in the Assyrian Empire, one or more Canaanite states would rise up, encouraged by Egypt's distant nods. Assyria would respond. Cities would burn. Leaders would be deported. Then order would be restored. In 724 BC, King Hosa of Israel refused to pay tribute, relying on Egyptian backing. Shalmaneser V besieged Samaria. After a siege that lasted as long as a generation feels to a soldier, the city fell. Israel was destroyed. Its people were deported. The northern kingdom vanished. The Philistine cities watched and learned, or thought they had. In 712 BC, Ekron and Gath rebelled, again with Egyptian encouragement. Sargon II crushed the revolt within 2 years. Both cities were destroyed. Ekron was later rebuilt, but the lesson had been carved deep into the soil. In 704 BC, Judah rebelled. Sennacherib marched west, ravaged the countryside, and besieged Jerusalem. King Hezekiah saved the capital only by paying a ransom so vast it echoed through later memory like a warning. Over time, the Philistine cities lost almost all political autonomy. Their sarins remained, but their decisions were constrained by imperial oversight. Yet something unexpected happened during the long stretches between rebellions. Philistia prospered. Under Assyrian rule, war receded just enough for commerce to surge. The 7th century BC became a period of rapid urban growth. Cities expanded outward, streets straightened, districts specialized. Chaos gave way to planning. Ekron, once scarred by destruction, grew into one of the largest cities in the Near East. Its footprint spread like a living thing, reaching a scale that would have been unimaginable in the early days of the Pentapolis. Residential quarters clustered together. Industrial zones emerged. Production was no longer scattered household by household. It was centralized. This is where the Philistines quietly rewrote their own legacy. Along the inner edge of Ekron's fortification walls, archaeologists uncovered more than 100 industrial olive presses. Not one or two. Not a family operation. An entire production complex capable of yielding more oil in a year than many regions could imagine in a lifetime. Olive oil became Philistia's lifeblood. Food, fuel, trade commodity. Wealth pressed from stone and patience. Under Assyrian administration, the Philistines elevated oil production to an industrial scale. Their exports flowed throughout the ancient Near East. Even under foreign domination, their cities became economic engines, turning land and labor into influence measured in jars and silver. But markets, like empires, never stay still. In the early 6th century BC, a powerful competitor emerged. Ionian Greeks revived trade across the southern Mediterranean. Their ships moved fast. Their networks cut prices. Slowly, Philistia's oil exports to Egypt lost their edge. Presses began to fall silent. Not all at once, but enough to feel the shift. Then the Assyrian Empire collapsed. For a brief moment, it looked like history might turn back in Philistia's favor. But the space Assyria left behind did not remain empty. It was filled by the Babylonian Empire. In 604 BC, on the orders of Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonian army captured, plundered, and destroyed Ashkelon. The Babylonian Chronicle records the date with chilling precision. Modern excavations reveal thick layers of ash, frozen testimony to a city's last day. That same year, Gaza and Ekron were destroyed after a Philistine revolt. Once again, some Philistine rulers appealed to Egypt. Once again, Egypt offered nothing. After 6 centuries on the Mediterranean coast, the brief independence the Philistines had regained after Assyria's fall ended under the weight of Babylonian conquest. Nebuchadnezzar II deported much of the population of the conquered Philistine cities to Mesopotamia. Administrative documents from Babylonia mention descendants of Aga, the last king of Ashkelon, living in captivity. For decades, deportees continued to identify themselves as people of Gaza or people of Ashkelon. Even far from the sea, identity clung like salt. The Nippur archive from the late 5th century BC still records individuals tied to these cities. These are the last known echoes of a people who once ruled the southern coast. After that, the trail fades. By the end of the 5th century BC, after more than a century in exile, those who once called themselves Philistines lost any distinct ethnic identity. They were absorbed into the wider Mesopotamian population, not conquered in battle, but dissolved by time. In the Persian period, after 539 BC, the coastal lands of former Philistia were resettled, now by Phoenicians. Almost nothing of Philistine culture survived. Cities like Ekron were remembered in name, mentioned centuries later, but never fully rebuilt. The stones remained. The people did not. Modern Gaza stands atop ancient Philistine Gaza, but its long, continuous history erased most archaeological traces of the Philistine period. It is the only city of the old Pentapolis that cannot be properly excavated. Memory there was layered too thick to peel back cleanly. Yet one thing endured: the name. From Peliset to Pelishim, the term became the ancient name for the land between Syria and Egypt. It appears in Herodotus, in Aristotle, in Strabo, in Pliny the Elder, even in Jewish writers like Josephus and Pho of Alexandria. And in 136 AD, after crushing the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman Emperor Hadrian renamed the province of Judea as Syria Palestina. The people were gone, but their name outlived them by millennia. The Philistines did not vanish because they were weak. They vanished because they adapted too well, blended too deeply, and survived long enough to be absorbed by larger forces. Born from collapse, forged by migration, strengthened by unity, broken by empire, remembered by myth, and misunderstood, perhaps, more than any people who ever stood on that narrow strip of coast where the sea meets the road between worlds.